First of all, I want to say I do believe in religious freedom, but if you pray against me, there will be no mercy. That was from the video from this morning, in case you missed it. More seriously, I want to say that as it is usually told, the origin story of religious liberty, at least in the West, people tell it as though it begins around the European Reformation or the European Enlightenment in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. The wars of religion between Catholic and Protestant princes had demonstrated that religious coercion, far from ensuring the ordered and stable society which had always been its justification, could only lead to bloodshed and chaos. And henceforth, people began to believe that if we were going to have a flourishing society, we need freedom of conscience, belief, and worship. That is how the story is usually told. But in my paper today, I wish to go back much further in history for some of the very first advocates for religious toleration, all the way back to the early church, especially in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And in the program you have, this talk is entitled Religious Freedom's Roots in Early Christianity, but I want to change it to Early Christian Advocates for Religious Liberty. And my point is not that this time and place has some exclusive, unique claim to the true beginning of religious freedom. There are other stories that could be told. And I'm not trying to say that early Christians were all full-throated supporters of religious freedom. Of course, the story is very mixed. There is a gradual increase in intolerance and coercion once Christianity takes over the Roman Empire. That being said, there were voices eloquently arguing for religious toleration, and they were doing so for deeply Christian reasons, and they deserve our attention today. And I do have an additional reason for choosing this period, because sometimes we Protestants like to tell the story as though it belongs to us, as though freedom of conscience was our particular heritage. We might link it to the doctrine of justification by faith alone, or for some of us, believers' baptism. But by going back to the early church, I hope to find some common ground for dialogue between Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox Christians. And I'm very happy to see the two talks right after mine are from a Catholic and an Orthodox perspective. So we begin today with a surprising figure, the early Christian apologist and polemicist Tertullian of Carthage, who lived from around 155 to 220 AD. And although Tertullian has been dubbed the father of Latin Christianity, he was the first Christian to write in Latin, he's never been recognized as a saint or a church father in the East or the West for different reasons, including his later embrace of the heresy of Montanism. Tertullian was actually quite a severe figure. He was writing in a time of persecution. He knew people who had been persecuted and martyred. And Tertullian was very anxious that the church remain separate from the world, both morally and philosophically. So this is not someone who is very welcoming of the world around him or other religions. And so it's very surprising that Tertullian is actually the very first writer in Western civilization to use the phrase religious freedom. Tertullian is the very first person who writes this phrase. And it occurs in a book of his called The Apology, where he's attempting to convince his pagan readers, his pagan audience, that Christians should not be persecuted. And here is what Tertullian writes. See that you do not end up fostering irreligion by taking away freedom of religion, there's the phrase, and forbid free choice with respect to divine matters. He's afraid that if you take away freedom of religion, that you're actually going to foster the opposite. So that I am not allowed to worship what I wish, but I'm forced to worship what I do not wish. Not even a human being would like to be honored unwillingly. The gods can only be honored if they're honored willingly. And traditional religion in the ancient world was focused on external actions, not internal states. It's about your outward behavior. They weren't so concerned about what was going on in your mind or in your heart. And especially Roman religion was focused on the expression of civic piety through public liturgical ceremonies. So in the Roman Empire, there's no distinction between sacred and secular, between culture and religion. It's all meshed in together. And the imperial authorities really had little interest in policing personal beliefs. There was freedom of belief in the Roman Empire. There were all sorts of philosophers and writers and thinkers expressing all sorts of ideas, but the empire was very concerned in how you worshipped, because deeds, not thoughts, mattered, especially whether or not you worshipped, you offered sacrifices to the emperor. But Tertullian's argument is that for worship to have any value, it must come from a willing heart. External behaviors without the heart being engaged mean nothing. And his argument can succeed only if he can convince his opponents that inward sincerity, not external act, is the principal portion of every piety. That prayers and devotions matter more than public sacrifice. And he's asking, how could the gods possibly accept acts of worship that had been compelled? Why would the gods want to receive a sacrifice that someone was forced to make against their will? It is unjust, he writes, to force free men to offer sacrifice against their will. Divine service requires a willing mind. Divine service requires a willing mind. And of course, Tertullian is echoing the words of Jesus, and even before Jesus, the Old Testament prophets. But what's interesting here is that Tertullian is leveraging this critique. He's not using it as an argument against paganism. He's trying to convince the pagans to approach their own religion differently. And of course, as John Bolin points out, at the start of the 3rd century, there was little reason to these arguments. There was little reason for pagans to listen to these arguments and concede these points. If public worship is no longer the principal portion of religious life, then religion can no longer fulfill its civic function, right? If religion primarily becomes something internal, then it starts to lose its power to bind society together. It can no longer index membership in the civic body, and Tertullian's innovations hardly offer a workable alternative index, at least not at this juncture. Nevertheless, a decade after Tertullian writes this apology, using this expression of freedom of religion, he addresses a tract to the Roman emperor, and he's writing on behalf of the other Christians in Carthage who are being repressed. And he writes, "It is only just and a privilege inherent in human nature that every person should be able to worship according to his own convictions. The religious practice of one person neither harms nor helps another. It is not part of religion to coerce religious practice, for it is by choice, not coercion, that we should be led to religion." Tertullian is arguing that freedom to worship according to your own convictions is a privilege inherent in human nature. And we shouldn't read all the later language of human rights back into this, but still he's talking about a privilege granted by God at creation. Man was created by God as free, with power to choose and power to act, he writes. There is no clearer indication in him of God's image and similitude than this, the outward expression of God's own dignity. So he's talking about human dignity being created in the image of God, yes, but a very core part of that is that God has given the gift of freedom of the will. He's given human beings the possibility to say yes or to say no to God. And that is where he grounds religious freedom. And Tertullian is just repeating what so many early Christian writers affirm. And we could generate a long list of them, but here is Irenaeus of Lyon. He's discussing the ancient law of human liberty, and he writes, God made man a free agent from the beginning, possessing his own power, even as he does his own soul, to obey the behests of God voluntarily and not by compulsion of God. For there is, he writes, there is no coercion with God. God does not force people to believe in him or not. God gives human beings freedom. And so Tertullian's remarks suggest, I think, two particularly Christian arguments for freedom of religion. One is theological, the other is practical. First, a theological argument. If God has granted human beings the gift of free will to enable us to have a genuine relationship of love with him between the creature and the creator, then we can't force that commitment on people without doing violence to the divine image. That is not the way God has designed human beings to be. And we're sinning against God when we try to force people to believe in him or to obey him against their will. That's the theological reason. But there's also a practical reason. If the ultimate virtues are faith, hope, and love, these are all internal dispositions. And it's not just Protestants who affirm this, but of course our Catholic and Orthodox brothers and sisters. If the ultimate virtues are faith, hope, and love, then religious compulsion would not even work. Right? You can compel outward behaviors, and you can force ritual actions. You can force people to be baptized at the point of the sword. You can force them to take the Eucharist at gunpoint. But the heart always remains beyond external compulsion. And therefore, human beings always possess freedom before God. I want to move on from Tertullian to the late 3rd century, to another Latin Christian whose name is Lactantius, who lived from about 250 to 325. And like Tertullian, he was born in North Africa. He converted to Christianity as an adult. And he was quite highly placed. He was an official professor of rhetoric at Nicomedia in Asia Minor, which at that time was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. So Lactantius is actually part of the imperial circle. He's at court, he has access to the emperor, but he resigned his post when, after a long period of relative toleration, the emperor Diocletian began to persecute Christians. Diocletian had come to the imperial purple after a rapid succession of emperors. There were 20 emperors in 40 years who had been brought to power and replaced by the army. So it was a period of chaos. And then Diocletian comes to power, and he realizes, I really need to establish the legitimacy of my reign. And he tries to do that by using religion. He tries to sacralize imperial authority by restoring ancient Roman worship. He's going back to the old traditions of Rome. And therefore the emperor cannot tolerate religious dissent because now it threatens the stability of the state and actually the entire civic order. If religion is the glue that holds society together, then as soon as you start having different religions, it invites chaos. So Lactantius, he flees the court of Diocletian because he's just become a Christian himself. He's seeing which way the wind is blowing. He sees persecution is coming. And he flees west to Germany, to the court of the future emperor Constantine. And there Lactantius is invited to tutor Constantine's oldest son, Crispus. So Lactantius is actually a very interesting character because he's someone who was involved in the court of Christianity's greatest persecutor, and then in the court of Christianity's greatest advocate. So he's a very unique perspective. And his greatest apologetic work, he wrote works defending the Christian faith against different pagan authors. His greatest work is his Divine Institutes, which he wrote sometime between the years 303 and 311. And Robert Louis Wilken argues that it's very likely that Lactantius read this book out loud in the court of Constantine, and the emperor actually heard or at least read these words. And it's very obvious that at least Constantine was quite impacted by Lactantius's ideas. And the Institutes are a rebuttal to pagan philosophers, especially Porphyry of Tyre. Porphyry was a celebrated Neoplatonist philosopher, and he'd actually, when he was younger, he'd studied under Origen of Alexandria, possibly the most brilliant thinker that Christianity has produced. And even if Porphyry was not an apostate from Christianity, at least he knew enough about Christianity to have some very sharp criticisms. They had some sting, and actually 30 different Christians wrote works responding to Porphyry's writings. And this was a philosopher, Porphyry. He was not content just to discuss ideas, just to do battles in the arena of words. He argued that Christianity, being seditious, antisocial, and blasphemous, should not be tolerated in the Roman Empire. He's interesting because he believed that actually Jesus was a prophet, he was a good person, he was a moral person. He followed his own path to God, which was valid, but Christians had greatly sinned by worshiping this human being as God, and therefore they were dangerous, they presented all kinds of problems. And he was actually invited to Nicomedia for Diocletian's first conference to discuss how are we going to launch this persecution. This philosopher is present at this conference. He's actively engaged in helping with this persecution. And in his book, he writes, how can these people, he's talking about Christians, how can these people be thought worthy of forbearance? How can they deserve tolerance? They have turned away from those who from earliest times are referred to as divine among Greeks and barbarians, and by emperors, lawgivers, and philosophers, all of a common mind. And to what sort of penalties might they not be subjected, who are fugitives from the things of their fathers? These Christians are bringing all sorts of novelties, all sorts of strange new ideas. They've abandoned the ancient traditions, those things that have kept our society safe and have ensured the protection of heaven, and they're going to cause all sorts of problems. And tolerant as we would like to be, we cannot tolerate these people, and they need to be crushed. So Lactantius is responding to the arguments of this philosopher, and he's trying to undermine the intellectual arguments for persecution. And he sounds, in some places, very much like Tertullian. He argues that nothing requires free will as much as religion. Nothing requires free will as much as religion. But he doesn't cite Tertullian directly. He quotes very little scripture, Lactantius. He goes back to the Roman tradition, all the way back to Cicero and these different writers. These people who emphasize that purity of mind matters as much as outward ritual. Lactantius argues for forbearance in matters of religion. By forbearance, he means that we should exercise patience and not take action against those whose religious beliefs and practices we may disagree with and even find repugnant. We can only tolerate something we disagree with, right? If we believe that all ways are valid and equal, then tolerance is not required. But Lactantius is a monotheist. He believes that Jesus is the only way to God, but we should exercise patience towards those of different beliefs. Why should we show such patience? Why should we show that kind of forbearance or tolerance? Because God himself shows forbearance towards the impious. And as his followers, we are called to show the same patience, entrusting ultimate judgment to God. Here's what he writes. But we, on the contrary, do not require that anyone should be compelled, whether he is willing or unwilling, to worship our God, who is the God of all men. Nor are we angry if anyone does not worship him. We're not trying to force anyone. We don't get angry if people disagree. Because we trust in the majesty of him who has the power to avenge contempt shown towards himself, as he also has power to avenge the calamities and injuries inflicted on his servants. And therefore, when we suffer such impious things, when we Christians are persecuted, we do not resist, even in word, but we remit vengeance to God. So, this persecution of Diocletian from 303 to 311 was Rome's final persecution, and it was also the most severe and the most bloody crackdown on Christianity before Constantine comes to the throne. So this is an interesting time because we're in a period of very rapid transition. Things are changing quickly. There's only 13 years separating the end of persecution of Christians to Christianity becoming the empire's preferred religion in the year 324. That is a breakneck speed of change. And for our purposes, the most important document produced in this critical time is what's called the Edict of Milan. It was a February 313 agreement between Constantine and Licinius, who were two of the three remaining Roman emperors, an agreement to follow a policy of toleration towards the Christian faith and all religions. Our only record of the edict comes from two letters issued by Licinius to his governors in the east later in the year. But the content is clearly driven by Constantine, who had become a Christian officially only months before. And you can really feel the influence of Lactantius in what is written. Now, the persecutions against Christians had already been ended by the Edict of Galerius in 311. And by the way, it's extremely difficult to track all the different emperors floating around at this time. But Galerius's edict is an expression of indulgence. He's saying, I don't like Christianity, I would wipe it out if I could, but the political reality says I have no choice but to allow this terrible religion to exist in my empire. It's a political calculation. But the Edict of Milan, by contrast, decrees the restoration of public rights, the restitution of churches, and the return of other confiscated real estate to Christians. But what's really interesting is the edict's language about religious freedom. Let me quote a few sentences. It should be conceded to everyone's intention and wishes that each person should look after religious matters according to his own choice. We grant both to Christians and to everyone the free authority of following whatever religion each one wishes. If someone should wish to follow such a custom or the same religious observance, he may be allowed to adhere to his purpose without impediment and may be hindered or prevented by no one, and that they may have a free hand to do whatever each one pleases without fear or suspicion. And there's a lot more in that document that is quite striking. And Olenski writes that the Edict of Milan is probably the first official document in at least the Western tradition to enact the principle of religious liberty into law, which is quite interesting coming from Constantine, who does not have the greatest reputation, at least in Protestant circles. So between the years 313 and 324, the Western Empire enjoyed religious freedom. Although Constantine, he restored rights to Christians, he just brought them up to the level of every other religion. And no religion enjoyed special privileges. Everyone was on the same level. And then in 324, Constantine conquers the East. He becomes the sole Roman emperor, and he becomes more public about his Christian faith, and he grants the church a privileged status. But other religions are still tolerated, and they still enjoy freedom in this new situation. In a letter written to his new subjects in the year 324, Constantine writes, that for the common advantage of the world and for all human beings, those who still rejoice in erring, those who are still wrong, they still should receive the same kind of peace and quiet, for it may be that restoring the sweetness of fellowship will prevail to direct them to the straight road. Constantine's saying, I am a Christian. I believe that Christianity is the true faith. I believe that these pagan religions are false. But the best way to bring them into the fold is by allowing freedom and liberty and allowing people to come to the faith by their own choice. And actually, if you sift through the evidence and look through the documentation of Constantine's reign, that on the whole, he followed a policy of tolerance towards non-Christian religions. Now, of course, the record becomes more mixed. And in the years after Constantine, the Christian commitment to religious tolerance, it is eroded by the temptations of coercion. Now that Christians have power, they're tempted to use it against other faiths. Sometimes it's by mobs, sometimes by bishops, sometimes by emperors. And the vision of Tertullian and Lactantius, this vision of religious liberty, begins to fade away. But these early Christian writers do at least offer us some of the theological basis for the ideal of religious liberty. Human free will as a participation in the image of God. True religion is a religion of the heart, and it cannot be compelled. And finally, trust in God to bring about his kingdom in his own time and his own way. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you. გთხოვთ არ მოგერიდოთ ქართულად დასვით შეკითხვები თუ ასეთი არსებობს ან კომენტარი გამოთქვით ან მოსაზრება კრიტიკაც შეიძლება რა პრობლემაა გთხოვთ ბატონო ზალ
მადლობთ დიდი მადლობა პასტორო ამ საუბრისათვის მე მინდა თქვა ლუკას სახარების მე-9 თავის 49 და 50 მუხლში წერია მიუგო იოანემ და უთხრა მას ქრისტეს მოძღვარო ვიხილეთ კაცი რომელიც შენი სახელით აძევებს ეშმაკთ და აუგრძალეთ ვინაიდან ჩვენ არ მოგდევს უთხრა მას იესომ ნუ აუგრძალავთ რადგან ვინც ჩვენს წინააღმდეგ არაა ჩვენს მხარესა. ანუ ჩვენ ვხედავთ, რომ პირველივე საუკუნეებში ჩვენ ვხედავთ, რომ იყო რაღაც იოანე ეუბნება ქრისტეს, როგორც თითქოს აზროვნება იმისა, რომ უნდა ჩამოყალიბდეს რაღაც ორგანიზმი, ისეთი ინსტიტუცია, ეკლესიური, მაგრამ მეორეს მხრივ ჩვენ ვხედავთ ადამიანს, რომელიც თავისთვის მსახურებს, ასე ვთქვათ, და არ არის ამ გაერთიანებაში, ეკლესიაში, მაშინ ასე არ ერქვა, მაგრამ ვთქვათ ასე. და ქრისტე ეუბნება, რომ გაუშვით, დამოუკიდებლად იმსახუროს, მიუხედავად იმისა, რომ არ არის ჩვენს ძმობაში, ასე ვთქვათ. ხომ არ ფიქრობთ, რომ თავიდანვე იყო ეს ჭიდილი ინსტიტუციონალიზმისა და ასე ვთქვათ დამოუკიდებლად მსახურების ინდივიდუალურ მსახურებას შორის და დღევანდელ დღეს თუ გადმოვიდათ ამ ყველაფერს ეს ჭიდილი დღესაც არის და ჩემი კითხვა ასეთია რამდენად მნიშვნელოვანი არის უпростоრად ინსტიტუციონალიზმის მორჩილება უფრო მნიშვნელოვანია დღევანდელ დღეს თუ ინსტიტუციონალიზმში პიროვნების უფლებები უფრო მნიშვნელოვანია. აი ასეთი და როგორ ხედავთ თქვენ მომავალში თანამშრომლობას ასე ვთქვი რელიგიური გაერთიანების და რომელიც ჩამოყალიბებულია ფუნდამენტალურია არსებულია, მაგრამ ინდივიდუალური მსახურებები, რომელიც არსებობს და არ არის, ასე ვთქვათ, ამ რელიგიურ გაერთიანებებში. მადლობთ.
Yes, that's a good question. I think in this time, people are thinking about religious freedom in terms of communities, not individuals. So Tertullian especially, but also Lactantius, are thinking about the rights of the whole community. And, thank you. And so therefore there's, even under Constantine, there's persecution not of other pagan religions, but of heretics within the Christian faith, the Donatists and the other groups that are going on their own way, and there's conformity that is enforced within the religious community, yes. So in this time, it's not individual, it's thinking in terms of community, and it's going to take a lot more thinking and development for the idea of actual, personal, individual liberty and the right of conscience to worship God in exactly the way that you wish, for sure.